Welcome back, gentle listener. Tonight we drift together into a world that never quite existed, and yet feels so familiar. A world of high green canopies, of laboratories humming softly in the dark, of creatures born from amber and ambition. Tonight we explore the 9 hybrid dinosaurs of the Jurassic Park universe, the creations that should not have been, the creatures stitched together from ancient bones and modern dreams, the shadows that moved through the corridors of forgotten facilities and the jungles of distant islands. Let your shoulders soften, let your breath slow. There is no urgency here, only a long, quiet story unfolding in its own time. We will travel through laboratories, across oceans, into the minds of scientists, and into the lives of creatures who never asked to be born. And we will do so gently, the way one walks through a museum after closing time, when only the soft lights remain. We want to thank you for supporting us, and it would mean so much if you could support the channel by leaving a like and subscribing to help us keep this channel going. Anyways, back to the video. Now close your eyes if you wish. Let the sound of my voice be the only thing you need to follow. The story begins long before the first hybrid was ever imagined, in a quiet laboratory, tucked away on a tropical island, where a man named John Hammond was dreaming of bringing the dead back to life. Long before the hybrids walked the Earth, before the great glass enclosures of Jurassic World rose from the soil of Isla Nublar, before the laboratories of Biosyn hummed in the high valleys of the Dolomites, there was simply a man with an idea. His name was John Hammond, and his idea was beautiful, terrifying, and impossible. He had grown wealthy through entertainment, through the showing of small wonders to crowds who paid to be amazed. He had displayed flea circuses, mechanical curiosities, robotic animals, and small marvels of engineering. But he wanted more. He wanted something that no one had ever shown before. He wanted to give the world creatures that had been gone for 65 million years. He wanted to give them dinosaurs. To make this dream real, he founded a company called International Genetic Technologies, InGen for short. The name was simple, almost forgettable, but what happened inside its walls would change the way humanity understood life itself. The science of recovering ancient DNA was, in those early days, more theoretical than practical. Scientists had long understood that genetic material decays over time. The longer something has been dead, the less of its genetic blueprint remains. By 65 million years, almost nothing should be left. Almost. But InGen scientists pursued a strange and elegant idea. They believed that some of that lost genetic material might still exist, preserved inside the bodies of insects that had bitten dinosaurs and then become trapped in tree resin. That resin, hardened over millions of years, would have become amber. Within those golden tombs, the scientists believed, mosquitoes and biting flies might still hold tiny droplets of dinosaur blood. It sounds like a fairy tale, this idea of pulling life from amber. And in many ways, it is. The actual science of it would be far more complicated than any movie could show. But within the world of Jurassic Park, this was the foundation, the sacred origin myth, the dream that started everything. InGen scientists, led by a brilliant and quietly ambitious geneticist named Dr. Henry Wu, began extracting trace amounts of dinosaur DNA from these amber-preserved insects. The samples they recovered were always incomplete. There were always gaps in the genetic code. Like an ancient book with pages torn out, the dinosaur DNA could not stand on its own. It needed something to fill in the missing chapters. So Dr. Wu and his colleagues did something that would have profound consequences for everything that followed. They used the DNA of modern animals to fill the gaps. They used the genetic material of frogs, of birds, of reptiles, of cuttlefish, of whatever creature seemed most appropriate to bridge the missing sequences. The animals that emerged from this process were not, strictly speaking, dinosaurs. They were dinosaur-like. They walked, they roared, they hunted, they laid eggs, they built nests. They behaved in ways that suggested deep prehistoric memory. But within their cells, modern animal DNA whispered alongside the ancient code. Every tyrannosaur was, in some small way, also frog. Every velociraptor was, in some small way, also something else entirely. This blending was not yet hybridization in the formal sense. It was a quiet patching, a kind of genetic stitching meant to produce something as close to the original as possible. But it taught Dr. Wu something. It taught him that the genetic code was malleable, that life could be written and rewritten, that what had once been considered fixed and sacred was, in fact, soft as clay in the hands of a skilled enough sculptor. Hammond did not at first understand the implications of this. He was a showman. He wanted dinosaurs because dinosaurs would draw crowds. He wanted his guests to walk through gates that bore his name and to gasp at brachiosaurs in the distance. He wanted families to gather and feel small in the presence of something vast and old. The science was, to him, simply the means to that end. But Dr. Wu understood. He saw, perhaps before anyone else, that what they were creating was not the past at all. It was something new, something that had never existed before. The animals in their paddocks were not resurrected. They were invented, and once that line had been crossed, every other line could be crossed too. The first park, the original Jurassic Park, was built on the island of Isla Nublar. It was meant to open to the public with great fanfare. There were tour vehicles, glass-walled visitor centres, gift shops, restaurants. There were paddocks for tyrannosaurs and triceratops, for velociraptors and dilophosaurs, for brachiosaurs and gallimimus. The infrastructure was magnificent. The dream was vast. You may already know how that first park ended. A storm, a betrayal, a power failure, a tyrannosaur breaking through a fence that should have held her, velociraptors slipping out of paddocks designed to contain them, lives lost, dreams ruined. The park was abandoned before it ever truly opened. But there was a second island, a quieter island, an island called Isla Sorna, where the actual breeding and rearing of the dinosaurs had taken place. Site B, they called it, the place where the magic was made before the magic was shown. While Isla Nublar collapsed into chaos, Isla Sorna remained, with its laboratories, its specimens, its abandoned hatcheries, and its growing population of dinosaurs that had been left behind. For years, Site B was kept as a secret. The animals there were allowed to grow wild, to form their own ecosystems, to live and die and reproduce on a forgotten island under the thick green canopy of tropical rainforest. The scientists were withdrawn. The funding was redirected. The original dream of John Hammond was for a time set aside. But corporations rarely allow such dreams to die. InGen was eventually acquired by a much larger company, a global conglomerate called Masrani Global. The new owner, Simon Masrani, was a man of vision and faith. He believed in Hammond's original promise. He wanted to fulfill it. He wanted to build the park that Hammond never could. And so, on the same island where the original park had failed, a new park began to rise. It was called Jurassic World. It was magnificent. It opened its gates to millions of visitors. It became, for a time, one of the great wonders of the modern age. Families came from every continent. Children pressed their faces against glass to watch mosasaurs swim. Tour gyroscopes rolled gently across plains where styracosaurs grazed. The dream had become real. But beneath the surface, something else was happening. Dr. Henry Wu, still leading the genetics division, had grown beyond the simple task of recreating extinct species. He had been there from the beginning. He understood the genetic code in ways no one else did. And he had quietly come to believe that simply recreating dinosaurs was not enough. The public, he argued, had grown bored. The wonder of the original creatures had faded. People wanted something new, something more terrifying, something that had never existed before. The corporate pressure was always there, whispering through the boardrooms and the financial reports. Attendance had to grow, new attractions had to be revealed. The next great creature had to be more spectacular than the last. And so Dr. Wu began to do something that had once been forbidden. He began to design dinosaurs from scratch. He began to combine the DNA of multiple species into single creatures. He began to make hybrids. The path to the first true hybrid was long, quiet, and largely unobserved. Dr. Wu worked in the shadows of his own success. He had a team of geneticists, but he kept his deeper experiments close. He was not a malicious man, not in any simple sense. He was a man in love with his craft, a man who saw the genetic code as a canvas and who believed that he, of all people, had earned the right to paint upon it. He began with small experiments. He blended traits from related species. He created creatures that bore the body of one dinosaur and the markings of another. Most of these early experiments did not survive. They died in their eggs, or shortly after hatching, or grew into forms too unstable to live. But Wu learned from each failure. Each one taught him something about how the code wanted to behave and where it resisted and how it could be coaxed. And in the deep laboratories of Isla Sorna, in chambers far from the eyes of any tour group, Dr. Wu's first true hybrids began to emerge from the artificial wombs. These were the prototypes, the forgotten ones, the creatures whose names would only later become known to the world. Among them was a creature so strange, so unstable, so dangerous, that even Wu himself could not fully control her. But before we speak of her, the listener should know that everything that follows came from this foundation. Every hybrid in this story exists because of Hammond's dream and Wu's ambition. Every monster in the corridors of Jurassic World, every escaped predator in the forests of Isla Nublar, every black market specimen sold at auction in Lockwood Manor, every distorted creature that emerged from the lost laboratories of the equator, all of them traced their lineage back to that first quiet decision. The decision to fill the gaps in the dinosaur DNA with the code of another animal. The decision to make life flexible. The decision to treat the genetic alphabet as a thing to be rearranged. This was the world before the hybrids, a world of dreams and corporate ambition, a world of glass and tropical heat, a world where the past was being slowly transformed into something new. And now, gentle listener, we move forward into the laboratories themselves. We move into the chambers where the first true hybrid was born, the one who came before the famous one, the one whose name was nearly lost, the one called Scorpius Rex. She was not meant to be remembered. She was not meant to be displayed. She was not meant to live, not really. She was meant to be a proof, a first attempt, a stepping stone. Her name, in the cold technical language of the laboratory, was E750. But the scientists who created her gave her another name. They called her Scorpius Rex. She was Dr. Henry Wu's earliest true hybrid creation, the one that came before Indominus, the one whose existence was kept secret even from the highest levels of the InGen corporate structure. She existed in shadow, in a quiet corner of the laboratory, in a paddock that did not appear on any official map. To look at her, even in the gentle light of the rearing chambers, was to understand that something had gone strangely wrong, or perhaps strangely right, depending on how one defined the work of genetic creation. She was not a beautiful creature in any conventional sense. She was something other. Her body was long and lean, like a great theropod hunter, but her limbs carried strange asymmetries. Her arms were short and sharp, ending in clawed fingers that twitched even when she slept. Along her back rose a row of long, slender spines, like the quills of some impossible porcupine. These were not decorative, they were venomous. Each one was tipped with a barb capable of injecting a paralytic toxin into anything that came too close. The quills could even be ejected, fired from her body like the venomous spines of certain ancient fish. Though Wu had not anticipated this development, it had emerged on its own. Her skin was a deep mottled red, the colour of dried blood, broken by patches of black that ran along her spine and tail. Her eyes were yellow, almost glowing, with vertical pupils that narrowed to slits in bright light and widened in the dark. Her teeth were uneven, some long, some short, growing in patterns that made no anatomical sense. Dr. Wu had blended her from several creatures: theropod base, velociraptor for intelligence, Carnotaurus for the lean predatory body, cuttlefish DNA for camouflage capabilities, though her camouflage never quite worked properly, reptilian DNA from various sources to provide the venom, and other components that Wu himself sometimes seemed reluctant to discuss. The recipe was experimental, almost reckless. He was learning, he was reaching, he was discovering what the code would allow. What he discovered was that the code would allow almost anything, but at a cost. Scorpius Rex was unstable from the moment she hatched. Her behaviour was erratic. She would alternate between long periods of motionless stillness and sudden, violent bursts of aggression. She killed her own siblings in the rearing chambers. She killed handlers who came too close. She seemed to have no capacity for the kind of training that other dinosaurs accepted. She did not respond to food rewards. She did not learn the routines that even the most aggressive raptors learned. She simply existed in a state of perpetual hostility, as if every cell of her body were screaming at the fundamental wrongness of her own creation. Dr. Wu observed her behind reinforced glass, his expression unreadable. He took notes. He recorded data. He did not pity her, not exactly, but he understood that she was a failure. Not a failure of science, but a failure of vision. She was too unpredictable to display, too dangerous to study closely, too unstable to reproduce. She was, in his clinical assessment, a dead end. And so a decision was made. Scorpius Rex would not be destroyed. Wu was a careful man, and he did not waste data. But she would be hidden away. She would be sedated. She would be placed into a state of induced hibernation, sealed in a containment chamber deep within the laboratories of Isla Sorna, and she would be left there, forgotten, a specimen preserved for later study, or perhaps a mistake quietly buried. For years she slept. The laboratories of Site B fell silent around her as InGen turned its attention back to Isla Nublar and the construction of Jurassic World. Her chamber was forgotten. Her files were buried in archives that no one accessed. The handful of scientists who had known about her either left the company or kept their silence. She became, in the most literal sense, a ghost, a creature suspended between life and oblivion, breathing slowly in the dark. But the world has a way of disturbing what should remain undisturbed. Many years later, after the original Jurassic World had fallen and the islands had been abandoned again, a new generation arrived. There were children, the so-called campers of Camp Cretaceous, who had been on Isla Nublar when the park collapsed. They had survived. They had hidden. And in their wandering through the abandoned facilities, they came across places they were never meant to find. Doors that should have stayed closed. Chambers that should have remained sealed. In one of those chambers, Scorpius Rex stirred. Her hibernation had been imperfect. Her systems had been slowly degrading for decades, and when at last her containment failed, she awoke into a world she did not recognize. The handlers were gone. The laboratory was a ruin. There was no one to restrain her, no protocols to follow, no purpose for her to fulfill. She did what she had always been built to do. She hunted. Her rampage through the ruins of the park was in many ways the saddest chapter in the story of any hybrid. She was not a monster of malice. She was a creature whose mind had been shaped by genetic instability and decades of frozen sleep. She killed because it was the only thing she knew how to do. She struck out at every creature she encountered, regardless of size or threat. She climbed trees. She moved through shadows. She fired her quills at any moving target. She was the embodiment of an experiment that should never have been completed. Eventually she was confronted by another creature, an older tyrannosaur and her offspring, who fought against her in the ruined heart of the abandoned park. The battle was brief and brutal in the way of nature. Scorpius Rex did not survive. She was overpowered by creatures whose bodies, though imperfect themselves, were at least the result of more careful design. Her blood mingled with the soil of Isla Nublar. Her quills lay scattered in the underbrush. And then she was gone, as quietly as she had been hidden. But before she died, something happened that the campers themselves did not fully realize at the time. Scorpius Rex laid eggs. Hidden in the deep underbrush of the ruined park, she left behind clutches of small mottled spheres. Some of these eggs survived. Some of them hatched in the quiet years that followed, producing further generations of unstable Scorpio's offspring. They were smaller than their mother, often even more unstable, and they did not live long, but they existed. They wandered the ruins of Jurassic World for a time, ghosts of a creature that had herself been a ghost. In this way, Scorpius Rex achieved a strange kind of immortality, not through fame, not through display, not through the official records of the company that had made her, but through her own biology, through the simple fact that life, once made, finds ways to continue itself, even imperfect life, even life that should not be. She's remembered by very few. The scientists who knew about her are largely gone. The campers who encountered her have moved on with their lives. Her name does not appear in promotional materials. She has no merchandise, no tour script, no animatronic display. She is, in every sense, the forgotten hybrid. But she was the first. Before Indominus, before Indoraptor, before any of the famous creations that would come to define the era of hybrid dinosaurs, there was Scorpius Rex. She showed Dr. Wu what was possible. She showed him also what could go wrong. Every hybrid that came after her was in some way an attempt to do what she had failed to do, to be stable, to be controllable, to be displayable, to be marketable. In her quiet failure, she paved the way for everything that followed. She was the cornerstone of the hybrid era, even though her name was scrubbed from the official record. She was the proof of concept that allowed Dr. Wu to convince himself that the next attempt would be better, that the next creature would be the one that worked, that the next hybrid would be a success. The next hybrid, of course, would be the one whose name everyone would come to know, the one whose creation would be approved at the highest levels of corporate authority, the one whose paddock would be visible on the maps of Jurassic World, the one whose escape would set in motion the events that would, eventually, bring the entire era of human control over dinosaurs to a close. Her name was Indominus Rex. But before we speak of her, gentle listener, take a moment. Let your mind rest a little. Picture, if you wish, the abandoned chamber where Scorpius Rex slept for so many years. Picture the dust settling on the glass. Picture the slow sound of her breathing in the dark. Picture the world above her changing while she remained still. There is something quiet and almost peaceful in the image of a forgotten creature, suspended between worlds. Even in failure there is a kind of stillness. And in that stillness the next chapter begins. Her paddock was called Number 11. It was the largest enclosure ever built by InGen for a single creature. It rose from the jungle of Isla Nublar like a great grey fortress, with concrete walls 40 feet high, reinforced with steel mesh, and equipped with infrared cameras that could see her even when her own genetic gifts allowed her to hide. The paddock had been designed to contain a creature that did not yet exist. It had been built around the idea of her, and only later did she grow into it. She was Indominus Rex, the undefeatable king, or rather the undefeatable queen, for she was female. Like all of the dinosaurs created by InGen, she had been engineered without male offspring, to prevent uncontrolled reproduction. But within that female frame lay something larger than any prior creation, something stronger, something smarter, something that should not have been alive at all. Her genetic recipe was the most ambitious that Dr. Wu had ever attempted. He had taken his lessons from Scorpius Rex and applied them with greater care, greater precision, and greater corporate backing. The Masrani board had approved her creation. The Jurassic World marketing team had already begun to plan her unveiling. She was meant to be the next great attraction, the creature that would pull millions of new visitors through the gates of the park. The base of her genome was Tyrannosaurus Rex. From the great queen of the late Cretaceous, she received her bulk, her bite force, her terrible jaw, and her general body plan. But from there, Wu had layered in a tapestry of other species. Velociraptor DNA for intelligence, Giganotosaurus for the long lean musculature of her flanks, Majungasaurus for the rough armoured ridges along her back, Carnotaurus for the small horn-like protrusions above her eyes, Therizinosaurus for the long curving claws on her hands. But the truly unusual additions were the modern ones. He had used cuttlefish DNA, which gave her the ability to alter the pigmentation of her skin, to camouflage herself against her surroundings. He had used tree frog DNA, which gave her the ability to mask her thermal signature, to lower her own body temperature to match the ambient air, rendering her invisible to the infrared cameras meant to track her. And he had used pit viper DNA, which gave her enhanced sensory awareness, the ability to detect heat at a distance through specialized receptors, to know where the warm bodies of her prey were even when she could not see them. This was a creature designed for hunting, designed for evasion, designed to be, in every conceivable way, the most formidable predator that had ever walked the earth. She was hatched in a small InGen facility within the park. From the moment she opened her eyes, she was alone. Her sibling, a second hatchling, had not survived the early days. Indominus, in her grief or in her hunger, or in some combination of the two, had killed and eaten her sibling. From that day forward she had no companion, no parent, no creature of her own kind. She grew up in isolation. She grew up watching her own reflection in the glass of her enclosure. She grew up listening to the muffled sounds of handlers who came only to feed her through reinforced hatches. She had no name that was used to her face. She had no relationships. She had no model for what her life should be. The handlers who watched her grow noticed strange things. She marked her enclosure with deep scratches in the walls. She tried to communicate with anything that approached her, calling out in a deep, resonant voice that carried through the jungle. When the calls were not answered, she fell silent for days. She watched, she remembered, she learned. By the time she reached adulthood, she stood over 40 feet long. She weighed many tons. Her hide was a pale, chalky white, pebbled with scales, marked with darker striations along her flanks. Her teeth were enormous. Her eyes were a strange yellow colour, deeply intelligent. When she looked at you, and the handlers all reported this, you felt that she was not simply seeing you. She was assessing you, studying you, considering you. She was, in many ways, the closest thing to a thinking monster that the world had ever produced. The events of her escape are well known. They unfolded on a single afternoon during the operating hours of Jurassic World, with thousands of guests in the park. She tricked her handlers. She used her chameleon abilities to mask herself against the wall of her enclosure, suggesting that she had escaped, drawing the handlers inside. Then, when they were within the paddock, she revealed herself, killed them, and used the open access door to walk out into the broader park. Once she was free, she did not immediately attack the visitor areas. She did something more disturbing. She began to hunt for sport. She killed creatures she did not eat. She slaughtered an entire herd of apatosaurs in a single afternoon, leaving their bodies scattered across the grasslands, taking nothing for food. She seemed to be expressing some kind of deep frustration, some kind of rage at her own existence. The park's response was disorganized. The asset containment unit was deployed but suffered heavy losses. Helicopters were dispatched. The park was eventually evacuated. And in the chaos, Indominus Rex moved through the jungle like a ghost, hunting, killing, occasionally pausing to communicate in her deep resonant voice with creatures she somehow recognized as kin. This was the most disturbing revelation of her escape. She had Velociraptor DNA in her, and she could speak to raptors. The pack of trained raptors that the park had developed under the guidance of Owen Grady, with their leader Blue, encountered Indominus in the deep jungle. And for a moment, the raptors appeared to ally with her. They turned against their human handlers. They stood beside her. She had spoken to them in some genetic language they all shared, and she had told them that she was their alpha. But the alliance did not hold. Indominus, in her arrogance, made a misstep. She communicated something to the raptors that betrayed her true nature. Or perhaps the raptors simply remembered Owen, the handler who had raised them. Whatever the cause, the alliance broke. The raptors turned back to fight beside their human pack, and the final battle of Indominus Rex's brief life began. It happened near the central plaza of the park in front of the Great Visitor Center. The aging Tyrannosaurus Rex of the park, a creature called Rexy, was released from her own enclosure to fight. The raptors joined the battle. Indominus fought with terrible strength. She nearly killed Rexy. She did kill at least one of the raptors. The plaza was destroyed. The lights of the park flickered and died. And in the end, when Indominus seemed about to triumph, she was dragged backward into the lagoon of the park, where the great mosasaur, a massive aquatic predator that had been the centerpiece of the park's underwater observatory show, rose up out of the water and pulled Indominus down into the depths. She did not surface again. The lagoon was still. The lights were out. The park was destroyed. And somewhere beneath the dark water, the body of Indominus Rex sank slowly to the bottom, joining the silt and the silence and the bones of all the other creatures that had ever drowned in those waters. She had lived in total less than a decade. She had walked free outside her paddock for less than a day. And yet she had reshaped the entire course of human and dinosaur history. The collapse of Jurassic World, the eventual abandonment of Isla Nublar, the trial of Dr. Wu and the dispersal of the dinosaurs to other locations, all of it traced back to her, to one creature, one hybrid, one queen who had never wanted to be a queen, who had only wanted in her own confused and angry way to know what she was. It is a sad story when you sit with it long enough. She was not born evil. She was born alone. She had no mother. She had no siblings, save the one she killed in her hunger. She had no name spoken to her with affection. She had no purpose other than to be looked at by tourists. Every aggressive instinct she displayed was, in some measure, a response to a life that had been designed without warmth. The handlers who knew her best, in the quiet years before her unveiling, sometimes spoke of her as if she were a child A vast, terrible, uncontrollable child. They said she watched the door of her paddock for hours. They said she sometimes tilted her head when she heard them speak, as if trying to understand. They said that when she killed her sibling, she did not eat her right away. She stood over the body. She made a sound that the handlers could not quite name. It was not a roar. It was something quieter. Whatever Indominus Rex was, she was not simply a monster. She was a creature stitched together from many lives, raised in a single empty room, given strength beyond her own capacity to manage, and then released into a world that did not know what to do with her. She was the product of corporate ambition, of scientific overreach, of the long, slow drift of John Hammond's original dream into something darker. Her body lies still beneath the lagoon of Isla Nublar. Or it did, until the events that followed. The island would be abandoned, the lagoon would crumble, and the genetic legacy of Indominus Rex would be carried forward in samples kept by Dr. Wu, samples that would become the foundation for the next great hybrid creation, the one that would be designed, deliberately, to be everything Indominus had been, and more. The one that would be smaller, faster, more intelligent, and more obedient. The one called the Indoraptor. But before we step into the shadowed corridors of Lockwood Manor, where the Indoraptor would make his terrible debut, take a breath, gentle listener. Let the story settle around you. Picture the dark waters of the lagoon, smooth as glass, holding their secrets. Picture the empty visitor centre, the silent rides, the jungle slowly reclaiming the broad concrete walkways. Picture all of it gone quiet, gone still, gone back to nature. Indominus Rex is at peace now. Whatever pain she carried in her brief and terrible life has been answered by the deep, cool water, and the next hybrid, born of her DNA but of an even darker purpose, is preparing to wake. Worst? No. His DNA was harvested from a single bone fragment, a rib, recovered from the lagoon of Isla Nublar by a small team of mercenaries working under contract for a man named Eli Mills. The bone belonged to Indominus Rex. It had not yet fully decayed. It still carried the genetic code of its creator, locked within the calcium and the marrow. Eli Mills was the personal assistant of Benjamin Lockwood, the elderly partner of John Hammond from the very beginning of the dream. Lockwood had been there at the founding of InGen. He had supplied the funds. He had believed in the vision. And after Hammond's death, after the failure of the original Jurassic Park, Lockwood had retired to his great manor estate, a vast Gothic structure on the coast, where he kept his memories and his fortune in equal measure. Mills, who had been hired to manage Lockwood's affairs, had grown ambitious. He had grown impatient. He had decided, without his employer's knowledge, that the dinosaurs of Isla Nublar represented a financial opportunity that should not be wasted. When the volcano of Isla Nublar erupted, threatening to destroy the remaining dinosaurs of the abandoned park, Mills orchestrated a rescue mission. Or rather, he orchestrated what appeared to be a rescue. In truth, the dinosaurs were not being saved for sanctuary. They were being collected for sale. The international black market for exotic creatures had quietly grown to include dinosaurs. Wealthy buyers, criminal organizations, and even certain governments had developed an appetite for prehistoric weaponry. And among these buyers, the most coveted creature was not a tyrannosaur or a velociraptor. It was a hybrid. Specifically, a hybrid designed for combat. A creature small enough to be deployed in urban warfare, intelligent enough to follow commands, and savage enough to terrify any enemy. Mills approached Dr. Henry Wu, who had by this point fled his trials and taken refuge in private contracts. He was no longer welcome in the official scientific community. But he was still the foremost geneticist in the world, and he still possessed his life's work. Mills offered him the resources and the freedom to create a new hybrid, one designed specifically as a prototype weapon, one whose buyer would set the standard for all the hybrids that followed. Wu agreed. He had by this point ceased to feel the moral hesitations that he might once have felt. He had crossed every line he was capable of crossing. The creatures he made were no longer extraordinary to him. They were simply extensions of his craft. He saw the new project not as ethics but as engineering. The new creature would combine the DNA of Indominus Rex recovered from the rib bone with the DNA of Velociraptor taken from a sample of Blue, the famously intelligent raptor trained by Owen Grady. The blending was intentional. The Indominus base would provide the size, the strength, the intelligence, and the stealth abilities. The Velociraptor component would provide the trainable temperament, the capacity for command response, and the social hierarchy instincts that had made raptors such effective pack hunters. The result was the Indoraptor, the hidden raptor, the shadow raptor, the hybrid designed to obey. He was smaller than Indominus, only about 24 feet long, lean and lithe and fast. His skin was almost entirely black, broken only by a single golden stripe that ran the length of his spine, splitting at his hips and continuing down both flanks. His eyes were a bright orange-yellow, set deep in his narrow skull. His teeth were long and curving. His arms, like those of his mother, ended in long, clawed hands. His legs were built for speed, ending in feet that bore the famous sickle claw of the raptor lineage, an enlarged second toe that he could raise and lower at will. He was, in every measurable sense, the most beautiful and the most terrifying creature that Dr. Wu had ever made. But beauty and terror are not the same as stability, and like Scorpius Rex before him, the first Indoraptor was not entirely sound. Wu himself acknowledged this. He warned Mills that the prototype was unstable. The blending of Indominus and Velociraptor's DNA had produced certain neurological inconsistencies. The creature was prone to fits of rage. He responded poorly to standard training. He needed, Wu said, a specific conditioning regimen that paired auditory and visual stimuli. A laser pointer would mark his target. A specific tone would command him to attack. With enough conditioning, the bugs in his behavior could be smoothed over. Future generations, Wu insisted, would be perfect. But Mills did not have time for future generations. He had already arranged the auction. The buyers were already arriving at Lockwood Manor. The prototype Indoraptor would have to do. The auction itself was held in the basement of Lockwood Manor, in a large stone chamber that had once been a wine cellar. Cages lined the walls. Within each cage was a dinosaur captured from Isla Nublar and shipped quietly to the manor. Tyrannosaurs, stegosaurs, triceratops, various smaller carnivores. Each was being sold to the highest bidder, often for sums in the tens of millions of dollars. The buyers were a strange assortment of men and women, drawn from the darker corners of the world, arms dealers, private military contractors, government representatives whose nations did not appear on any official invitation list. And at the climax of the auction, the Indoraptor was wheeled into the chamber. He was contained in a reinforced cage, drugged into partial sedation, his eyes glowing softly in the dim light. The auctioneer described his abilities, the intelligence, the trainability, the stealth, the capacity for urban warfare. The bidding began at $10 million and climbed rapidly. The room was thick with greed and curiosity. The auction was interrupted before it could be completed. Owen Grady and Claire Deering, who had infiltrated the manor with the help of others, set in motion a rescue of the captured dinosaurs. In the chaos that followed, the Indoraptor's cage was damaged. He woke, and he escaped. What followed was perhaps the single most haunting sequence in the entire saga of the hybrids. The Indoraptor, freed from his cage, did not flee the manor. He stalked through it. He moved silently from room to room, hunting whoever he found. The mercenaries who tried to corral him died quickly. The buyers who ran for their cars were caught and torn apart in the great front entrance. The manor, which had been built by Benjamin Lockwood to celebrate his life, became a slaughterhouse. But the Indoraptor's true target was a child. Maisie Lockwood, the granddaughter of Benjamin Lockwood, was hiding in the upper floors of the manor. She was herself a kind of hybrid, although she did not yet fully understand what she was. She was a clone, the genetic copy of Lockwood's deceased daughter, brought back to life through the same processes that had created the dinosaurs. The Indoraptor seemed to sense her presence. He climbed the walls of the manor with terrible dexterity. He moved through the corridors. He pressed his face against the windows of her bedroom, peering in through the glass with his glowing eyes. It is one of the saddest images in the entire story. A child hiding under her bed, listening to the soft scrape of claws against the floorboards. A creature, born without family, hunting another creature, born without family. Two beings, both created in laboratories, both the products of human ambition, meeting across the threshold of a child's bedroom. The Indoraptor did not catch Maisie. Owen Grady and Blue, the trained Velociraptor, intervened. The final battle took place on the roof of the manor, beneath a glass dome that displayed the night sky. Blue and the Indoraptor fought. Owen and Claire and Maisie tried to escape, and in the chaos of the fight the Indoraptor fell. He plunged through the glass dome and landed below on the spike of an exhibit. A great Triceratops skull mounted as a centerpiece of Lockwood's private museum rose up from the floor like a fang of stone. The Indoraptor came down on its horn. He was impaled. He died slowly, shuddering, his life leaking out onto the polished marble. His body lay there until the manor was abandoned. He was, like Indominus, a creature whose existence had ended in a fall. The Indoraptor is often remembered as the most evil of all the hybrids, the most sinister, the most malevolent. But this framing, when one looks closely, is not entirely fair to him. He was made for evil. He was designed for it. Every trait he possessed, every instinct, every behaviour had been deliberately engineered to make him a weapon. He had no mother, he had no pack, he had no opportunity to learn anything other than violence. The cruelty he displayed was not chosen, it was installed. In this way, he was like Indominus, but more so. She had at least been given the freedom to grow up in a paddock, however empty. She had at least been allowed the dignity of her own development. The Indoraptor was created for a single purpose: sale, combat, death. He was a product, a prototype, a line item in a corporate ledger. He had no chance to be anything else. When you sit with his story in the gentle hours of the night, you might find yourself thinking less about his terror and more about his loneliness. The image of him pressing his face against the window, peering in at the child, is perhaps the most revealing image in the entire saga. He was, in some strange and broken way, looking for someone, or looking for something. He did not have the language to know what he was looking for. He only had the instinct to seek. And he found a child who, like him, had been created in a laboratory, a child who, like him, had no biological mother, a child who, like him, was a question that the world had not yet answered. Maisie survived. The Indoraptor did not. But the connection between them, that brief and terrible moment of recognition, lingers in the story. It suggests that even the most weaponized of creatures carry, somewhere within them, the same yearnings as the rest of us. The desire to be known, the desire to be answered, the desire not to be alone. His body was eventually removed from Lockwood Manor. The estate was sold. The dinosaurs that had been freed during the chaos of the auction escaped into the surrounding forests. The world entered a new phase. Dinosaurs were no longer confined to islands. They walked among us. The era of the parks was ending. The era of the open world was beginning. And in this new era, new hybrids would emerge. Lesser-known ones, quieter ones, creatures whose stories had been told only in the quiet corners of the larger saga, creatures from the games, from the supplemental files, from the abandoned notebooks of Dr. Wu, creatures whose very existence had been forgotten until the time came for them to walk back into the light. Let your mind rest now, gentle listener. The Indoraptor is gone, the manor is silent. Picture, if you wish, the great Triceratops skull standing alone in the moonlight, dust slowly settling on its horns. Picture the broken glass of the dome above. Picture the empty rooms. There is something almost peaceful about a battlefield after the battle has ended. Something quiet that returns when the violence has spent itself. The next chapter is a softer one. We move from the famous hybrids to the forgotten ones. The ones whose stories were told in whispers. The ones who lived only in the margins. The ones who were never given the chance to step into the spotlight. We move now to the secret hybrids, the lost creations of Dr. Wu's quieter projects, the Stegoceratops, the Spinoceratops, the Stygidoc, and the others who never made it out of the laboratory. In the long catalogue of Dr. Henry Wu's creations, there are creatures whose names appear only in private notebooks, in encrypted laboratory files, in supplemental records that were never meant to be released to the public. These were the experiments that did not make it to the great paddocks of Jurassic World, the hybrids that did not appear in any promotional material, the ones that lived briefly, often quietly, in containment chambers and rearing pools, and then either died or were quietly destroyed. To know them is to know a softer side of the hybrid story. They are not the famous monsters. They do not have feature films built around them. They do not appear in the trailers or on the merchandise. They exist in the shadow regions of the canon, in the games, in the novelizations, in the supplementary materials that fans of the saga have collected over the years. And yet they are part of the story. They are part of the great tapestry of genetic creation that defined the era. Among these forgotten hybrids was the Stegoceratops. She was a creature whose name combined two distinct prehistoric lineages. The Stegosaurus, with its great kite-shaped plates rising from its back, and the Triceratops, with its massive bony frill and 3 forward-facing horns. Wu had, in his quieter moments, attempted to combine these two herbivore designs into a single creature. The reasons were partly aesthetic. The hybrid would be visually striking. She would draw the eye in the herbivore paddocks. She would stand out among the more familiar designs. The Stegoceratops, when she was created, looked exactly as her name suggested. Her body was built like that of a Triceratops, low and broad and powerful, with thick legs and a heavy gait. Her head bore the characteristic 3 horns and the great bony frill of the ceratopsian lineage. But running along her back, from shoulders to tail, rose a row of large flat plates, like those of a Stegosaurus, in shades of green and brown. Her tail ended in a cluster of long, sharp spikes, the famous thagomizer of her stegosaur ancestors. She was, by all accounts, a peaceful creature. She grazed slowly, she moved in a deliberate, ponderous manner. She showed no signs of the aggression that defined the carnivorous hybrids, and yet she was never put on display. The reasons varied. Some sources suggest that her genetic stability was poor, that she was prone to ailments and short lifespans. Other sources suggest that the Masrani board was not ready, in those early years, to debut a herbivore hybrid alongside the planned launch of Indominus. The Stegoceratops was kept in private holding pens. She lived a quiet life. She was studied. She was photographed. And then, when her relevance to corporate strategy faded, she was either destroyed or quietly transferred to the holding facilities on Isla Sorna, where she lived out her days in obscurity. Another forgotten hybrid was the Spinoceratops. As her name suggested, she combined the DNA of the Spinosaurus, the great river-dwelling predator of the African Cretaceous, with that of the Velociraptor. The result was a creature of moderate size, roughly the length of an Allosaurus, with the characteristic long crocodile-like snout of the Spinosaurus and a small sail along her back. Her body was built for speed and agility, her arms strong and grasping, her legs lean and powerful. She had the intelligence of a velociraptor with the predatory specialization of a Spinosaurus. She could hunt on land. She could hunt in shallow water. She could pursue prey across long distances. The Spinoceratops was, by all reports, an effective predator. But she was also unpredictable in her behavior, prone to long periods of inactivity broken by sudden bursts of focused hunting. She did not socialize well with other dinosaurs. She did not respond to standard training protocols. She was in some ways a more functional and successful version of Scorpius Rex. But she suffered from the same fundamental problem. She was difficult to display, difficult to predict, difficult to monetize. She was kept, like the Stegoceratops, in private facilities. Her existence was acknowledged in the quiet corners of the InGen records, but not in the public face of the company. She lived, she hunted, she slept. And eventually, when the islands were abandoned, she either died of natural causes or was lost in the chaos of the great evacuations. The Stygidoc, sometimes called the Stygimolochus or the Pachydok, was another creature of Wu's quieter experiments. She combined the DNA of the Stygimoloch with its dome-shaped skull and curving horns, and the Pachycephalosaurus with its even thicker dome and larger body. The result was a creature whose head was a great bony mass, almost hammer-like in form, with horns radiating outward in unusual directions. Her body was small, stocky, built for ramming. She was, in effect, a living battering ram. She was created as a curiosity. Wu had been fascinated by the head-butting behavior of the Pachycephalosaur lineage, and had wondered what would happen if those traits were exaggerated, intensified, combined. The Stygidoc was the answer. She existed for a time in the rearing pools of Isla Sorna. She was studied. She was filmed. She was eventually deemed insufficiently interesting for public display. And like the others, she faded into the quiet background of the hybrid catalogue. There were many others. Wu's notebooks contained sketches and partial designs for hybrids that never even reached the rearing stage. There were proposed combinations of Ankylosaurus and Triceratops, of Therizinosaurus and Velociraptor, of various marine reptiles and modern fish. Most of these never came to fruition. Some were attempted and failed in the embryo stage. A few hatched and lived briefly before dying of genetic instabilities. And then there were the creatures who were not strictly hybrids in the genetic sense, but who were modified, enhanced, altered in ways that placed them in a kind of intermediate category. The velociraptors who had been bred for specific behavioural traits. The tyrannosaurs whose growth patterns had been adjusted to produce larger or more docile specimens. The mosasaurs whose size had been deliberately exaggerated to make them more impressive in their lagoon shows. All of these creatures carried in their cells the marks of human design. When you walk through the abandoned paddocks of Jurassic World, in the years after the park has fallen, you can sometimes find evidence of these forgotten hybrids. A skeleton in a dry pool, half buried in mud. A discarded data tablet with a creature's profile still partially loaded on the screen. A research log abandoned on a dusty desk, with handwritten notes about an experiment that never was completed. The traces are everywhere, if you know where to look. They tell a story that the official records omit. A story of ambition that exceeded its grasp. A story of curiosity that did not always pay off. A story of life created for purposes that were not always clear, even to the creators themselves. Dr. Wu, in his more reflective moments, sometimes seemed to acknowledge this. In private interviews and in the few public statements he made before his trials, he spoke of his creations with a kind of distant fondness. He did not regret them exactly. He did not apologize for them. But he sometimes seemed to recognize that he had brought into existence a great many lives that should not have existed, and that those lives, once created, had carried weight that he had not anticipated. It is one thing to design a creature on paper. It is another to watch her grow. It is another still to watch her live and die. The forgotten hybrids of Dr. Wu's catalogue were not all monsters. Many of them were, in their own ways, simply creatures. They ate. They slept. They moved through the world in the small spaces allotted to them. Their lives were brief, their stories untold, their names known only to a handful of people. But they lived. They were here. The mobile games and supplementary materials of the Jurassic World saga have, over the years, expanded this list of forgotten hybrids. There are dozens of them, sometimes hundreds, depending on how broadly one defines the category. Some are pure imagination, never appearing in the central canon. Others are extensions of established designs, modified slightly for variation. Together, they form a kind of dreamlike menagerie, a parade of creatures who exist in the margins of the larger story. Among them, there are creatures whose names are almost lyrical. The Indominus Rex variants, the Spinoceratops, the Tyrannosaurus megamutant, the Glithranax helix, each one a small invention, a small dream, a small attempt to see what would happen if certain genetic codes were combined. And among them, in the quiet corner of Wu's catalogue, there is a creature called the Magna Pirata. She was an early experiment in armoured hybrids, combining elements of the Carnotaurus and the Diplodocus, an unlikely pair. Her body was small, her armour thick, her temperament gentle. She was never released. She was never displayed. She lived in a holding pool for most of her brief life and died of natural causes. She's mentioned only in a single research log, which has been recovered and translated by enthusiasts who follow the deeper canon of the saga. These are the forgotten ones, the lost children of the laboratory. They do not have famous names. They do not have great tragedies. They have only the simple fact of having been alive briefly in a world that did not have room for them. And in some ways they are the most poignant of all the hybrids, because they did not die in spectacle, they did not fight epic battles, they did not haunt children's dreams, they simply lived and died quietly in spaces designed for other purposes. They were experiments that did not pay off, creatures whose stories were not deemed worth telling. But they are part of the story. Even now, as we drift towards sleep, they are part of the story. Let us take a moment for them. Let us imagine, just briefly, the Stegoceratops grazing in her quiet pen, the soft sound of her chewing the only sound in the warm afternoon. Let us imagine the Spinoraptor pacing slowly along the edge of her pool, watching the water. Let us imagine the Stygidoc sleeping in the corner of her enclosure, her great bony head resting on her forelimbs, dreaming whatever dreams a hybrid creature dreams. They were here, They are gone, but for a moment they were alive. And the next hybrids in our story were not so quiet. They were trained for purpose, designed for violence, and unleashed upon the world in coordinated packs. They were the next generation of the engineered predator. They were the Atrociraptors. The world had changed by the time the Atrociraptors emerged. The islands of InGen had been abandoned. The dinosaurs that had once been confined to Isla Nublar and Isla Sorna had spread across the globe. Some had escaped during the auction at Lockwood Manor. Others had been smuggled out during the chaos of the volcanic evacuation. Still others had been bred or cloned by other companies, by other geneticists, by other people who had learned, often illegally, the techniques pioneered by Dr. Wu. The era of the parks was over. The era of the open world had begun. Dinosaurs walked through forests in North America, across plains in Central Asia, through rivers in South America. They had become a global presence. They were no longer rare. They were no longer contained. And in this new era, new players had entered the scene. Among the most prominent was a company called Biosyn. Biosyn had been a quiet rival of InGen for many decades, dating back to the very early days of de-extinction. They had attempted in the past to steal dinosaur embryos from InGen. They had not entirely succeeded. But over the years, Biosyn had patiently built up its own genetic capabilities. By the time the islands had fallen, Biosyn was ready to step into the void left by InGen's collapse. Biosyn was led, at this stage, by a man named Lewis Dodgson. He had, in his younger years, been the architect of the original embryo theft attempt. He was a man of patient ambition, of quiet menace, of the kind of intelligence that does not announce itself but simply waits. He had taken control of Biosyn and turned it into the foremost dinosaur-related corporation in the world. He owned a vast research facility in the Italian Dolomites, a great valley enclosed by mountains where he kept his dinosaurs in semi-natural conditions, ostensibly for research, but in practice for far darker purposes. Among Dodgson's chief operatives was a woman named Soyona Santos. She was a geneticist of exceptional skill. She had trained, in part, under the legacy of Dr. Wu's published research, and she had developed her own specialized practices that went far beyond traditional cloning. She was an expert in behavioral conditioning, in the training of dinosaurs for specific tasks. And she had, at some point in her career, decided that the most lucrative application of her skills was the breeding of designer predators for criminal organizations. The Atrociraptors were her creation. They were not, strictly speaking, hybrids in the same sense as Indominus or the Indoraptor. They were Atrociraptors, a real species of dromaeosaurid that had been recovered through cloning. But Santos had bred them selectively, modified them genetically in subtle ways, and trained them with a precision that placed them in a category beyond their natural ancestors. They were, in every meaningful sense, designer creatures. They were the next phase of the hybrid era. There were 4 of them, at least in the most prominent pack. Each had a name, each had a distinct coloration, each had been trained to respond to specific commands. Ghost was the lead female with pale grey scales that blended into shadow and stone. Her coloration was the lightest of the pack. Her movements were the most precise. She was the alpha. She made the first decisions in any hunt. She was named for her ability to disappear into her surroundings. Tiger was striped, in shades of orange and black with the bold patterning of her namesake. She was the most aggressive of the pack, the most prone to direct confrontation. She did not hide. She charged. She attacked with overwhelming force. Red was, as her name suggested, marked with deep red and orange tones along her flanks. She was slightly smaller than her packmates, but faster, more agile, capable of cutting off prey at unexpected angles. Panthera was the darkest of the 4. Her scales were almost entirely black, marked only by the faintest hints of dark green. She moved through forests like a shadow. She specialized in nighttime hunting, in stalking, in the slow, patient pursuit that ended in sudden violence. Together they formed a pack of unparalleled effectiveness. They had been trained to respond to a small handheld device that emitted a specific laser pointer signal. When the laser marked a target, the pack would pursue that target relentlessly until it was killed. Distance was not a barrier. Obstacles were not a barrier. The training had been so deeply ingrained that the Atrociraptors would pursue their target across cities, through buildings, over rooftops, through traffic, until the target was either dead or the laser was disengaged. This made them, in the broader criminal economy, extraordinarily valuable assets. They were assassins, they were enforcers, they were weapons. They could be deployed in environments where human assassins would be too obvious, too noisy, too traceable. The Atrociraptors moved silently. They left no fingerprints. They could be recalled by their handlers when their work was done. They were, in effect, the perfect tools. Soyona Santos commanded them with a strange and unsettling intimacy. She had raised them. She had trained them from birth. She knew each of their personalities. She spoke to them in a low, murmuring voice when she gave them their orders. She fed them by hand. She inspected their teeth and their claws after each successful mission. She seemed, in her own way, to love them. This is one of the most disturbing elements of the Atrociraptor story. Santos was not a sadist. She was not a cartoonish villain. She was a professional. She believed in her craft. She believed that her creatures were, in their own way, magnificent. And she treated them with the kind of focused care that another person might reserve for a prized horse or a beloved dog. The fact that she had bred them as killers did not seem to register, in her own mind, as a moral failure. They were what they were. She had made them well. She was proud of her work. The events that brought the Atrociraptors into the broader story took place in the streets of Malta, a small island nation in the Mediterranean Sea. Owen Grady and Claire Deering had travelled there in pursuit of information about a global crisis involving genetically modified locusts. Their investigation had brought them into contact with Santos, and Santos, recognising the threat that Owen represented, had unleashed the Atrociraptor pack on him. The chase that followed was one of the most extraordinary sequences in the entire saga. Owen Grady, riding a motorcycle through the narrow medieval streets of Malta, was pursued by 4 trained predators. They moved across rooftops. They leapt from balcony to balcony. They followed him through markets and over walls and across the broad public squares of the ancient city. Tourists scattered. Vehicles crashed. The Atrociraptors moved with single-minded focus, pausing only when the laser signal was momentarily lost, then resuming their pursuit the moment it returned. Owen survived, in part because of his deep familiarity with raptor behaviour, and in part because of the timely intervention of his allies. But the Atrociraptors did not all die in that chase. Some were killed, others escaped. Their fate, in the larger world, became uncertain. The Atrociraptors raise a different kind of question than the earlier hybrids. They were not lonely creatures. They had each other. They had their pack. They had Santos, who, however dark her purposes, had at least raised them with attention and care. They were not products of corporate marketing. They were not designed for display. They were designed for use. But they were still made by humans, made for human purposes, made to kill what other humans wanted killed. They had no choice in any of it. They had no chance to be anything other than what they had been bred and trained to be. There is a moment in the chase through Malta when one of the Atrociraptors pauses on a rooftop. The laser signal has been temporarily lost. Owen is out of sight. The raptor stands still, scanning the city below her. For a brief instant, she is simply a creature on a rooftop. She's not pursuing anyone. She's not killing anyone. She's just standing in the warm Mediterranean sunlight, looking out over a beautiful old city with the wind moving softly through her feathers. In that moment, you can almost imagine what she might have been if her circumstances had been different, if she had been born wild, if she had not been raised in the conditioning chambers of Soyona Santos, if she had not been given a laser-driven purpose. She might have been a hunter in some quiet forest, raising her own offspring, living her own life. She might have known something other than violence. But the laser signal returned, and she resumed the hunt. This is the tragedy of the Atrociraptors. They were intelligent, social, capable creatures. They had every quality that a noble predator might possess, and those qualities had been bent toward the most cynical of human purposes. They were not monsters. They were tools that had once been creatures, and the line between the two, in their case, had been deliberately blurred. When Owen and his allies finally subdued the surviving Atrociraptors, when they brought them in to be cared for in legitimate sanctuaries, the question of what to do with them became philosophically complex. Were they prisoners? Were they patients? Were they wild animals? Were they pets? They had been trained too thoroughly to be released into any wild environment. They could not be simply set free, But they had also never lived as ordinary dinosaurs. They had no ordinary instincts. They had only their training. In the years that followed, the surviving Atrociraptors were placed in special enclosures designed for their unique needs. Specialists were brought in to attempt to deprogram their conditioning. Some progress was made, some was not. They lived out their days as a strange testament to what had been done to them. The Atrociraptors were not hybrids in the classical sense, but they were the next step in the broader hybrid story. They were the proof that the techniques pioneered by Dr. Wu had escaped his own control. The genetic and behavioural engineering of dinosaurs had become a global industry. It was no longer the province of a single corporation. It was a tool used by criminals, by governments, by anyone with enough money and enough patience to acquire the necessary technology. And in this new world, where engineered dinosaurs walked everywhere, the next great chapter of the saga was already unfolding, in the high mountains of the Italian Dolomites, in the great valley of Biosyn, where Lewis Dodgson kept his quiet menagerie of cloned creatures, including some of the most magnificent predators ever to walk the earth. The Giganotosaurus, the Therizinosaurus, creatures whose own genetic stories carried the marks of the hybrid era, even if they were not hybrids themselves. Let yourself rest now, gentle listener. The Atrociraptors are at peace, or as close to peace as they will ever come. The Mediterranean sun is setting over the city of Malta. The ancient stones glow with the warm light of evening. Picture, if you wish, the surviving Atrociraptors in their new enclosure, somewhere safe, somewhere quiet, watching the sky as it turns from gold to deep blue. They are not free exactly, but they are no longer hunted, and that is perhaps the closest thing to peace that they will ever know. The next chapter takes us to the high valleys of the Dolomites, where the great cloned predators of Biosyn watched over the lands they had been given, the Giganotosaurus and the Therizinosaurus, creatures of immense power, whose stories belong to the broader hybrid saga, even though they were not in the strictest sense hybrids themselves. The valley of Biosyn lay high in the Italian Dolomites, surrounded by mountains that rose like the walls of some natural fortress. From the air, the valley appeared as a great green basin, crisscrossed by rivers, dotted with stands of ancient trees, marked here and there by the low grey buildings of the research facility. To the casual observer, it might have looked like a wilderness preserve, a sanctuary, a place where the cloned dinosaurs of the modern era could live in something approaching their natural state. But Biosyn was no sanctuary. It was a research operation, run with the cold precision of a global corporation. Every dinosaur in the valley was under observation. Every behaviour was logged. Every interaction was studied. The animals were not pets. They were resources. And Lewis Dodgson, the man at the head of Biosyn, had designs upon them that went far beyond simple research. Among the creatures in the valley, two stood out for their sheer scale, the Giganotosaurus and the Therizinosaurus. Neither was a hybrid in the strict sense of having combined genetic codes from multiple species. They were, on the surface, faithful clones of their prehistoric ancestors. But their cloning processes had used the same techniques pioneered by Dr. Wu in the early days of InGen. They carried within their cells the same modern animal DNA used to fill the gaps. They were, in a real sense, products of the same scientific lineage that had produced the great hybrids. They were cousins of the hybrid story, even if they were not its central characters. The Giganotosaurus was, when she walked the earth in life, perhaps the largest land predator ever to have existed. The original species had lived in what is now South America, roughly 95 million years ago, and had reached lengths of over 40 feet, with weights exceeding 8 tons. She was longer than a Tyrannosaurus rex. She was, by some measures, more massive. She was the apex of a particular branch of the predatory dinosaur family tree. The Giganotosaurus of Biosyn Valley was a creature of astonishing presence. She moved with a slow, deliberate gait, her great head held low, her tail counterbalancing her bulk. Her hide was a deep mottled brown, broken by darker patches and lighter streaks. Her teeth were enormous, longer and more curved than those of a Tyrannosaurus, designed for slicing rather than crushing. Her eyes were small and dark, set deep in the broad bones of her skull. When she opened her mouth to roar, the sound carried across the entire valley. She was the apex predator of Biosyn Valley. The other carnivores deferred to her. The tyrannosaurs, including the original Rexy from Jurassic World, who had been brought to Biosyn after the collapse of the islands, gave her wide berth. Even the cloned allosaurs and the various smaller predators avoided her territory. She walked where she chose. She killed what she wanted. She slept beneath the great pines of the valley's higher slopes, her massive body half hidden in the shadows. But she was not a creature of pure malice. She was simply a creature being a creature. She hunted because she needed to eat. She killed because that was the only way she knew to acquire food. She fought when challenged. She rested when she could. The drama of her existence, in the eyes of the Biosyn researchers, was its own kind of theatre. They watched her on infrared cameras. They tracked her movements. They studied her social behaviours, of which she had few, since she largely operated alone. She would, in time, become a key figure in the events that brought the Biosyn era to a close. She would clash with the original Rexy in a battle that shook the central facility. She would face the Therizinosaurus in a moment of mutual recognition. She would, in the end, walk away from Biosyn Valley alongside the other surviving creatures when the operation collapsed and the dinosaurs were released to find their own ways in the world. The Therizinosaurus was a different kind of presence. Where the Giganotosaurus was a creature of obvious menace, the Therizinosaurus was a creature whose strangeness took longer to understand. She was a herbivore, by ancient lineage. Her ancestors had been plant-eaters, browsers of high foliage, dwellers of forests. But her body was built in a way that made her, even as a herbivore, profoundly intimidating. She was tall, standing perhaps 30 feet from foot to crown when fully upright. Her body was bulky, covered in a coat of long, shaggy feathers in shades of brown and gold. Her neck was long. Her head was small, adorned with a rounded beak. Her eyes were large and dark, gentle in their gaze, almost cow-like in their soft expressiveness. She might have been beautiful in a quiet sort of way. She might have looked like a great ancient relative of the modern emu or cassowary. But her arms ended in claws, and what claws they were. Each claw was over 3 feet long, sweeping outward in a great curving arc, sharp as a knife blade, capable of slicing through tree trunks. The original Therizinosaurus species had used these claws to draw down branches for feeding. The cloned Therizinosaurus of Biosyn Valley used them for the same purpose, most of the time. But when threatened, when alarmed, when something stepped into her territory that she did not recognize, she could lift those great claws and bring them down with terrifying force. She was blind, or nearly blind. The cloning process had produced certain ocular irregularities, and she had developed cataracts at a young age. She navigated her world primarily through hearing and smell. She could detect the scent of an intruder from a great distance. She could hear the rustle of a leaf from across a clearing, but she could not see clearly, and her response to anything she could not identify was caution at first, then defensive aggression if the intrusion persisted. The interaction between the Therizinosaurus and the human characters who eventually wandered into her territory was one of the quietest and most haunting moments in the saga. Claire Deering, while attempting to navigate the dangerous landscape of Biosyn Valley, found herself in a small body of water, half submerged, trying to remain absolutely silent while the Therizinosaurus stood only a few feet away. The Therizinosaurus could not see Claire, but she could sense her. She moved her head from side to side, she listened, she smelled. Her great claws hung loosely at her sides. Claire had to remain perfectly still, perfectly silent, while the gentle giant tried to determine whether something was there or not. It was not a hunting moment. It was a moment of negotiation between two beings who could not fully communicate. The Therizinosaurus was not malicious. She was simply uncertain. And uncertainty, in a creature of her size and strength, was its own kind of danger. Claire survived that encounter by remaining still, by remaining patient, by trusting that the Therizinosaurus would eventually move on, and the Therizinosaurus did move on. She returned to her browsing. She continued her quiet life among the trees of the valley. These two creatures, the Giganotosaurus and the Therizinosaurus, were not hybrids in the technical sense, but they belonged to the same broader story. They were products of the same scientific tradition. They carried, in their cells, the same modern animal DNA that had been used in every cloning process since the beginning. And they lived in a facility whose true purpose was not their preservation, but their exploitation. The exploitation took many forms. Biosyn used the dinosaurs for medical research, for genetic studies, for the development of new pharmaceutical compounds derived from prehistoric biology. Some of this research was, in itself, ethically defensible. The discovery of new medicines from ancient genomes was a real and meaningful pursuit. But there were other research streams that were less defensible. There were experiments with dinosaur tissue intended to produce biological weapons. There were studies of dinosaur pheromones intended to manipulate animal behavior in ways that crossed certain lines. And among the most disturbing of Biosyn's projects was the locust program. The locusts were not dinosaurs. They were insects, but they were genetically modified insects, engineered using the same techniques that had produced the dinosaurs and the hybrids. Biosyn had created a strain of giant locusts, larger than any natural locust species, with extended life cycles and enhanced feeding capacities. These locusts had been designed to consume crops grown from competitors' seed lines, while leaving Biosyn's own proprietary crops untouched. It was an act of corporate sabotage on a planetary scale. The locusts were intended to ruin the food supply of any country that did not buy from Biosyn, forcing global agriculture into dependency. The plan was monstrous in its ambition, and the locusts had escaped containment. They had begun to swarm across the agricultural regions of North America. They threatened, in their unchecked spread, to cause a global famine. This was the broader crisis that drew Owen Grady, Claire Dearing, and the other characters of the saga into their final confrontation with Biosyn. The locust crisis was not directly about the dinosaurs, but it was about the same fundamental question that the dinosaurs had always raised. What happens when humans gain the power to redesign life? And what happens when those redesigns escape their original purposes? The answer, the story suggests, is that there are no clean boundaries. Genetic engineering, once unleashed, does not stay contained. The dinosaurs of Isla Nublar had escaped to the wider world. The hybrids had escaped Lockwood Manor. The locusts had escaped Biosyn. Each act of creation had produced consequences that exceeded the imaginations of the creators. The genetic genie, once let out of the bottle, would not return. Lewis Dodgson, in the end, did not survive the final collapse of Biosyn. He died in the underground facility, attempting to escape with samples of his most valuable creations, when the system failed and the released dinosaurs tore through the corridors. His death was, in many ways, an echo of the deaths that had come before, the deaths of those who had believed themselves to be in control. But the Giganotosaurus and the Therizinosaurus survived. They walked out of Biosyn Valley alongside the other dinosaurs into the broader world. The Giganotosaurus took her place in the global ecosystem of escaped creatures. The Therizinosaurus, with her gentle blind eyes and her terrible claws, continued to browse the high foliage of forests in regions where she had no natural predators and no natural place. She existed, like all the post-island dinosaurs, in a world that had not been built for her and that did not yet know how to hold her. These were not hybrids, but they were part of the hybrid story. They were proof that the techniques once developed could be applied to anything, to herbivores, to carnivores, to insects, to plants, to organisms that had not yet been imagined. And in the deepest corners of the dinosaur era, in laboratories that had operated even after Biosyn's collapse, there were creatures still being made. Hybrids more profound, more disturbed, more unstable than any that had come before. Creatures designed in secret, hidden in remote facilities, never released to the public, never named in any official record. These were the creatures of the lost equatorial laboratories, the creatures of the final experiments, and among them, the most haunting of all, was the Distortus Rex. Let your breath slow now, gentle listener. The valleys of Biosyn are quiet. The locusts have, in time, been controlled. The Giganotosaurus walks her own path through forests far from her birthplace. The Therizinosaurus stands quietly in some unnamed grove, her great claws hanging at her sides, her cataracted eyes turned toward the sound of wind in the leaves. The world is changing. The world has changed. And in the warm equatorial waters, on a small island that does not appear on any map, the next hybrid story is waking up. The island had no name, or rather it had several names, but none of them were on any official map. To the small handful of personnel who worked there, it was known as Site 5, or sometimes simply the lab. To the corporate executives who funded its operations, it was known by a code phrase that changed every few years to prevent paper trails from forming. To the ocean currents and the migrating birds and the small fish that swam in the warm waters around it, it had no name at all. It was simply a piece of land in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by sea. The island was located somewhere in the equatorial belt, in waters too remote to be regularly patrolled by any nation. It had been chosen for this very remoteness. Whatever happened on the island would not be observed. Whatever escaped the island, if anything escaped, would have to swim a very long way before reaching civilization, and whatever experiments were conducted there could be carried out without the interference of regulators, of journalists, of the watching eyes of the public. After the collapse of Biosyn, after the death of Louis Dodgson, the official structure of the dinosaur cloning industry had been dismantled. The major corporations had been broken up. The patents had been distributed. The remaining laboratories had been, in theory, shut down. The era of large-scale dinosaur production had, in theory, ended. But theory and reality in matters of corporate biology are rarely the same. Certain interests had survived the dissolution. Certain laboratories had continued to operate under the radar, using equipment salvaged from the great facilities of the past. Certain geneticists had continued to pursue their work, often in defiance of international law, often without the oversight of any ethical body. They had taken their craft underground, and on small islands and in remote facilities they had continued to make creatures. The laboratory on Site 5 had been operating for years before it was discovered. It had been founded by a consortium of investors who believed that the dinosaur market, although officially closed, still represented enormous untapped potential. They had hired geneticists who had been trained in the lineage of Dr. Wu's research. They had constructed rearing facilities, holding pens, observation chambers, and they had begun a new round of experiments intended to push the hybrid science further than it had ever been pushed before. The results of these experiments were, by any measure, deeply disturbing. The hybrids of the official Jurassic World era had been unstable, troubled, often dangerous. But they had at least been, on the whole, viable. They could live, they could function, they could, in some sense, be displayed. The hybrids of Site 5 could not be displayed. They could not be released. They could not, in many cases, even survive long. They were the products of experiments that had pushed the genetic code beyond its capacity to hold itself together. They were creatures whose bodies had been redesigned so radically that the basic functions of their biology were compromised. Among them, the most prominent was the Distortus Rex. Her name, in the cold technical language of the laboratory, was a clinical description. Distortus, from the Latin meaning twisted, deformed, distorted. Rex, the standard suffix for tyrannosaurid hybrids. She was a tyrannosaur whose form had been so altered that her shape no longer resembled any natural creature. To look at her, even in the soft red lights of her containment chamber, was to feel a deep and quiet sorrow. She had 6 limbs. The original tyrannosaur body plan had only 4. Whatever process had produced her had introduced an additional pair of forearms, smaller than her primary forearms, growing out of her chest. These extra limbs ended in clawed hands that twitched constantly, as if the nervous system that controlled them did not entirely know what to do. Her skull was massive, larger than that of any Tyrannosaurus rex, but malformed. The bones did not align properly. Her jaw hung slightly askew. Her teeth were uneven, some growing inward, some outward, some twisted into spirals that should not have been possible. Her eyes were small and sunken, set in a face that seemed perpetually pained. Her hide was a pale grey, almost translucent in places, marked by dark patches of damaged tissue. She walked with a hunched gait. Her hind limbs were not quite even in length, and she favoured one side as she moved. Her tail was long and powerful, but it dragged behind her rather than carrying itself with the dignity of a typical tyrannosaur. Her breathing was loud, laboured, marked by occasional wheezing as her oversized lungs worked against the constraints of her malformed rib cage. She was, in every measurable sense, a creature in pain. She had been made wrong. The genetic code that produced her had been pushed too far, combined too aggressively, modified beyond what biology could sustain, and yet she lived. Her vitality, the deep, stubborn force that had carried her ancestors through 65 million years of evolution, refused to give up on her, even as her body failed her in countless ways. The geneticists who created her had not intended for her to be like this. They had wanted to produce a more intimidating tyrannosaur, larger, stronger, more visually striking. They had aimed at improvement. What they had produced was distortion. The DNA had not cooperated with their ambitions. The code had its own logic, its own limits, its own way of expressing itself when forced into configurations it did not want to take. She lived in a containment chamber on Site 5. She was fed regularly. She was monitored constantly. The geneticists studied her. They took samples. They made notes. They tried to understand what had gone wrong so that future hybrids could be made better. She was, in their view, a learning opportunity, a teacher of failure. But she was also alive. She was a creature with a creature's awareness. She watched the handlers when they came near her chamber. She made sounds that were not quite roars, not quite cries, but something in between, a deep mournful noise that echoed off the steel walls. She seemed, when she looked at you with her small dark eyes, to be aware that something had gone wrong, to be aware that her existence was not what existence was supposed to be. She was not the only creature on Site 5, there were others. The Mutodons were a smaller hybrid species, raptor-like in their general form, but with tooth structures that suggested an avian ancestry. They moved in groups rather than packs, with no clear social hierarchy. They were prone to seizures. Many died young. The few that survived to adulthood were nervous, twitchy creatures, whose behaviour was governed more by anxiety than by hunger or territorial instinct. There were the various distorted theropods, creatures that were, in some cases, almost recognisable as known species, but with proportions wrong, limbs misaligned, faces marked by asymmetries that could not be explained by natural variation. They lived in shared pens. They sometimes fought one another. They sometimes huddled together in ways that suggested they were seeking comfort from creatures who, like them, had no clear sense of what they were supposed to be. There were the herbivore experiments, creatures whose bodies had been combined from multiple herbivore lineages in ways that produced strange chimeras. Some of these creatures had multiple sets of horns, growing in confused patterns. Some had limbs that did not match their bodies. Some had digestive systems that struggled to process even the simplest foods. They lived briefly, often, before their bodies failed them. And there were the experiments that did not belong to any clear category, creatures whose forms were so different from anything in the prehistoric record that they could not be named in reference to any known species. The geneticists called them simply by numerical designations: Specimen 12, Specimen 34, Specimen 107, each number representing a creature, a life, a being whose existence had been written in code and stitched together in artificial wombs. This was the dark heart of the hybrid era. Not the famous monsters of the parks, not the trained predators of the Mediterranean, not the great cloned beasts of the Italian valleys, but the silent, suffering creatures of the lost laboratories, the ones who never made it into the public eye, the ones whose existence was, even by the standards of the genetic engineers, an admission of failure. The Scorpius Rex was the most prominent of them, but she was not the most tragic. She was simply the largest, the most visible, the one whose suffering could be seen most clearly. The smaller hybrids, the failed experiments, the brief lives that flickered out in containment chambers, they were the deeper sadness of Site 5. They were the lives that no one mourned. They were the names that no one remembered. Eventually, of course, Site 5 was discovered. A small expedition, working under the authority of an international conservation group, located the island through a combination of satellite imagery and human intelligence. They landed on the beach, they found the laboratory, they documented the conditions, they photographed the creatures. The footage they brought back was, when it was eventually released, deeply unsettling to the global public. Most people by this point had grown accustomed to the existence of dinosaurs in the wider world. Most had accepted, or had at least learned to ignore, the moral complexities of the cloning industry. But the creatures of Site 5 were something different. They were not dinosaurs in any heroic sense. They were not the proud cloned giants of the past. They were creatures who had been broken in their making. International outrage followed. There were investigations. There were trials. The investors who had funded Site 5 were, in some cases, brought to justice. The geneticists who had worked there were, in some cases, blacklisted. The laboratory itself was shut down. The creatures, where possible, were either euthanized or transferred to specialized sanctuaries where their pain could be managed for as long as their lives lasted. The Distortus Rex was among those transferred. She lived out her remaining years in a quiet enclosure, in a remote sanctuary in northern Europe. Her caretakers gave her what comfort they could. They reduced her stress. They managed her pain. They allowed her to walk in a small grove of trees in the soft light of the high latitudes. She was not happy exactly. Happiness, in any meaningful sense, was beyond her capacity. But she was, perhaps, less unhappy. She was less alone. She had handlers who spoke to her gently. She had food that was prepared with attention to her needs. She had, in the end, a kind of peace. She died, eventually, of the same biological problems that had plagued her since her birth. Her body, never built to function properly, simply gave out. She was, by the records of the sanctuary, 8 years old at her death. A short life, by the standards of any tyrannosaur, but longer perhaps than any of the geneticists who had created her had expected. She had outlived her maker's worst fears. She had, in her own quiet way, persisted. She was buried in the grove where she had walked. There was no marker, there was no ceremony, beyond a few quiet words from the handlers who had cared for her. She had not been a famous creature, she had not been celebrated, but she had been alive, and her caretakers in their final farewell recognized that life. They mourned her in the soft way that one mourns a creature whose existence had not been her fault, and whose suffering had not been her doing. This is perhaps the deepest and quietest part of the hybrid story, not the spectacles, not the disasters, not the cinematic confrontations, but the long, slow recognition that all the creatures, even the most distorted, even the most failed, even the most hidden, deserved some form of compassion. They had not asked to be born. They had not chosen their forms. They had only inherited the consequences of human ambition, and in their brief lives they had carried that inheritance as best they could. Let your mind rest now, gentle listener. The grove in northern Europe is quiet. The wind moves softly through the leaves. The Distortus Rex is at peace, beneath the soft soil of a forest that holds no judgment of her. Her great body has returned to the earth. Her strange six-limbed form is gone. Her mournful voice no longer echoes through containment chambers. She's at rest, in the deep way that all creatures eventually rest. The next chapter takes us out of the laboratories and into the world in which all of these creatures, the great and the small, the famous and the forgotten, now coexist. The post-hybrid world. The world that emerged from the long, strange experiment of bringing the past back to life. The world that emerged after the fall of the laboratories was a different world. It was not a world of parks. It was not a world of contained displays. It was a world in which the creatures of the genetic era walked among the ordinary ecosystems of the modern Earth, finding their own places, building their own lives, dying their own deaths. This was not the future that John Hammond had imagined. He had wanted the dinosaurs to remain attractions. He had wanted them to live in carefully managed paddocks, to be observed by paying visitors, to provide entertainment and wonder in equal measure. He had not imagined them as residents of the wider world. He had not imagined them as competitors to existing wildlife. He had not imagined them as neighbours. But the islands had failed. The auctions had spilled their cargo. The volcanic eruptions had freed entire populations. The corporate collapses had released breeding populations into the wild. By the time the dust had settled on all the disasters of the hybrid era, dinosaurs were no longer rare. They were no longer confined. They were everywhere. The forests of North America were home to herds of cloned Parasaurolophus, who had adapted surprisingly well to the temperate climates. Their crested calls echoed through the redwoods of California, through the pine forests of New England, through the mixed woodlands of the Appalachian Range. They grazed on local vegetation. They drank from local streams. They lived alongside elk and deer and moose in ecosystems that had not seen creatures of their size since the last ice age. The plains of Central Asia had become home to populations of Triceratops, who had migrated across the steppes in herds reminiscent of the great bison migrations of an earlier era. Their broad bodies moved slowly across the grasslands, their three horns lowered in defensive postures when wolves or wild dogs approached. They had become, in many ways, simply another large herbivore in the landscape, accepted by the local fauna in the way that all new arrivals are eventually accepted. The rivers of South America held spinosaurs. The mountains of Europe held populations of small theropods. The savannas of Africa had become home to creatures that, by some genetic happenstance, had returned to the continent where many of their ancestors had once lived. The world had been reseeded in the strangest of ways with prehistoric life. And among them somewhere lived the surviving hybrids. The Indominus Rex was gone, the Indoraptor was gone, Scorpius Rex was gone, the Distortus Rex was gone. The famous monsters of the saga had all died, in their various ways, within the timelines of their stories. They had not lived long. They had not had descendants in any significant sense. They had been, in the end, brief flares of genetic ambition, burning out as quickly as they had ignited. But the genetic legacies of the hybrids persisted. The samples remained. In the sealed vaults of corporations that no longer existed, in the personal collections of geneticists who had moved on to other careers, in the storage facilities of the international conservation groups that had inherited the responsibility for managing the post-hybrid world. The DNA was still there, the recipes had been preserved, the capacity to make new hybrids had not been destroyed. This was, perhaps, the most enduring tension of the post-hybrid era, the question of what to do with the genetic heritage of the experiments. Should the samples be destroyed to ensure that no future Indominus could ever be made? Should they be preserved in the interest of scientific knowledge? Should they be locked away, neither destroyed nor used, in the hope that future generations might develop the wisdom to handle them better than the present generation had? There was no clear answer. Different countries adopted different policies. Different corporations made different decisions. Some samples were destroyed, ceremonially, in public events that drew international attention. Other samples were preserved, in deep cold storage, in vaults beneath mountains where they would remain frozen for centuries. Still other samples disappeared into the private collections of individuals whose names did not appear in any official record. The genetic material, like the dinosaurs themselves, had escaped the boundaries of any single authority. The Atrociraptors who had survived the chase through Malta lived out their days in specialized sanctuaries, slowly being deprogrammed from their conditioning. Some of them, in the later years of their lives, came close to something like ordinary raptor behavior. They formed new pack bonds with other rescued raptors. They hunted in their enclosures, on their own terms, without laser pointers or human commands. They slept in the deep grass of their sanctuary forests, in something that resembled peace. The various lesser hybrids who had been recovered from the abandoned facilities lived in conservation programs. The Spinoceratops, the Spinoceraptor, and the others, where they survived, were kept in conditions designed to maximize their comfort and minimize their stress. They were not displayed to the public. Their existence was acknowledged but not celebrated. They lived as creatures, simply in spaces designed for their needs. The Giganotosaurus and the Therizinosaurus, who had walked out of Biosyn Valley, became part of the broader population of escaped dinosaurs. The Giganotosaurus eventually settled in a remote forest region, where she lived as a solitary apex predator. The Therizinosaurus, with her gentle blind eyes, found a quiet wooded valley where she could browse the high foliage in peace. They were rarely sighted. They preferred their solitude. And the Distortus Rex, in the cold grove where she had been buried, slowly returned to the earth. The dinosaurs, taken as a whole, had become a permanent feature of the global ecosystem. They were no longer extraordinary. They were no longer the subject of constant news coverage. Children grew up in regions where dinosaurs roamed and considered them as ordinary as any other large animal. Conservation agencies developed protocols for managing them. Tourist industries arose around the dinosaur sanctuaries, offering carefully managed wildlife viewing in safe environments. The world had adjusted, as worlds always do, to the presence of the new. But the hybrids, specifically, had largely vanished. They had been too unstable, too short-lived, too genetically fragile to establish breeding populations. Most of them had died without descendants. The few who had reproduced, like Scorpius Rex with her hidden clutches, had produced offspring whose own genetic instabilities had limited their longevity. Within a few generations, the hybrid bloodlines had thinned to nothing. The unique creatures of the hybrid era had been, almost without exception, evolutionary dead ends. This was, in some sense, a mercy. The hybrids had been creatures whose existence had been marked by suffering. Their genetic instabilities, their psychological isolation, their inheritance of human ambitions for which they had not asked, had made their lives difficult. The fact that their lineages did not continue meant that the suffering at least did not continue. They had been allowed in the end to disappear. But it was also a kind of loss. Each of the hybrids, for all the troubles of their making, had been a unique form of life. There had never been an Indominus Rex before her, and there will never be one again. There had never been an Indoraptor, and there will never be another. The scientific decisions that had produced them had been irresponsible, ambitious, often cruel, but the creatures themselves had been, in their own ways, extraordinary. And their disappearance, like the disappearance of any unique form of life, carries with it a quiet sadness. Dr. Henry Wu, in the years following his trials, wrote a series of reflective essays about the work he had done. He did not, in these essays, fully apologize. He did not admit in any direct way that he had been wrong, but he did acknowledge that the work had carried weights he had not fully understood at the time. He spoke of Indominus as a creature he had not known how to raise. He spoke of the Indoraptor as a creature he had built without sufficient consideration of what it would mean for the creature to live. He spoke of the forgotten hybrids as evidence of his own restlessness, his own unwillingness to leave the genetic code alone. He died eventually of natural causes in a small house on a quiet coast. He left behind no children. His genetic legacy, ironically, was carried only in the creatures he had made, all of whom had also died without offspring. He was buried with the modest formality appropriate to a man whose work had been controversial. His grave bore his name and the dates of his life, and nothing more. The story of the hybrids is, in the end, a story about ambition meeting biology. The geneticists who made them had believed, at various stages of their work, that they could control what they were creating. They had believed that the genetic code would obey them. They had believed that intelligence, design, and corporate planning could shape life into whatever form was desired. What they discovered, again and again, was that life resists. The code does not always cooperate. The creatures once made have their own existences, their own needs, their own ways of being that the makers had not anticipated. The dinosaurs of Jurassic Park had escaped their paddocks. The Indominus had escaped her containment. The Indoraptor had escaped his auction. The Atrotoraptors had escaped their training. The Scorpius Rex had, in her own quiet way, escaped the laboratory's intentions for her by simply being a creature in pain rather than the magnificent specimen they had hoped for. Life, in all its forms, exceeds the imagination of those who try to control it. It is larger than its makers. It is more complex than its blueprints. It carries within itself the deep insistence that has driven evolution for billions of years. Even the most engineered creature, even the most distorted hybrid is still alive, still aware, still expressing the deep ancient force of being. This is perhaps the most important lesson of the hybrid era. Not that genetic engineering should never be attempted, not that science should never push its boundaries, but that the creatures we make are not products, they are lives, and lives carry their own weight, their own consequence, their own claim upon the world. The hybrids are gone now. The Indominus, the Indoraptor, the Scorpios, the Distortus, all of them have returned to the earth. The Atrotoraptors live out their days in sanctuaries. The forgotten hybrids of the supplementary records have faded into rumour. The corporations that made them have collapsed or transformed. The scientific community has, slowly and incompletely, learned to be more careful. But the dinosaurs themselves remain. The cloned tyrannosaurs and triceratops and velociraptors and brachiosaurs. The escaped populations that have established themselves in forests and plains and mountains around the world. They are not hybrids. They are not, in most cases, distorted or unstable. They are simply dinosaurs, living their lives in a world that has made room for them. In time, they too will pass. Cloning, like any technology, has its own life cycle. The current generation of dinosaurs will age and die. New generations will be born, in smaller numbers, under more controlled conditions. Eventually, the cloning programs will end entirely, and the dinosaurs will fade from the world as their ancestors faded 65 million years ago. The age of dinosaurs, in its modern revival, will end. The Earth will return to its baseline state, with whatever wisdom it has gained from the brief return of the past. And then, perhaps, the next chapter will begin. new experiments, new ambitions, new ways of pushing the boundaries of what life can be. Perhaps mammals will be cloned next, perhaps marine species, perhaps creatures whose ancestors have been gone for so long that their resurrection requires science we have not yet imagined. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the lessons of the hybrid era will at last be learned. Perhaps humanity will set down its tools, step back from its ambitions, and let the Earth simply be what it is. Perhaps the dream of resurrection will, in the end, be replaced by the deeper dream of acceptance. The acceptance that what is gone, that the past, however magnificent, belongs to its own time, that the present has its own creatures, its own beauty, its own story to tell. The choice belongs to whoever comes next, to the geneticists of the future, to the corporations of the future, to the children of the future, who will grow up in a world shaped by the decisions their elders made. The hybrids of Jurassic Park were a brief and intense chapter in the long story of human attempts to redesign life. Whether that chapter ends in wisdom or in a new round of ambition is not yet decided. The last page has not yet been written. But for now, in this quiet hour of the night, the hybrids are at rest. The world is still. The creatures of the past, both the great and the small, both the famous and the forgotten, sleep in the deep way that all creatures eventually sleep, and we, gentle listener, sleep alongside them. What hybrid creature do you find most haunting? Which one stays with you after the story ends? Drop a comment and share your thoughts. It is always a quiet wonder to know which creatures linger in the minds of listeners around the world. Now let your breath slow. Let your shoulders soften. Let the images of the night drift gently from your mind. Picture, if you wish, a great quiet forest at dusk, where the long shadows of ancient creatures move softly between the trees. Picture the sound of distant rain, the smell of wet leaves, the deep calm of a world settling into its own night. Every creature in that forest is at peace. Every footstep is muted. Every breath is slow. The hybrids are not there. The laboratories are not there. There is only the forest and the rain and the soft darkness and you. Sleep well, dream gently, let the prehistoric world cradle you into rest. Good night. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one.